My name's Ash, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the LGBTI Family Violence and Homelessness Project Worker at Wombat Housing Support Services.
Hi, my name's Rory. I use he, him and they, them pronouns, and I'm an LGBTI advocate.
In this video, we're going to provide you with some information about what family violence, homelessness and mental health might look like amongst LGBTIQ+ young people, and some things you need to keep in mind when working with them.
So we know from research and also anecdotally that the rates of homelessness, family violence and also mentally ill health amongst LGBTI young people are at much higher and more disproportionate rates than their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts. Unfortunately in Australia we do have a lot of research gaps in sort of talking about the nuances of that, the reasons behind that and also some of the unique experiences. However, we know at least with family violence and homelessness, LGBTI young people experience very similar types of violence and similar types of reasons behind homelessness. However, we also experience a range of things that are unique to being LGBTIQA+. As a sort of minority and a population that are discriminated against, we have particular vulnerabilities that are exploited. For example, in terms of homelessness and housing, often LGBTI young people might find discrimination in the rental market. We might be forced out of home at an earlier age due to family violence. We also might have trouble in terms of accessing support services that accept us and treat us respectfully. With family violence, we know that LGBTI young people experience family violence at much higher rates and at much younger ages as well, often to do with disclosure around sexuality and gender identity, causing sort of that family discrimination. We also know that the perpetrator in families are most likely to be the parents and most likely to be the father of the young people. However, we also know intimate partner violence also occurs at much higher rates, and again, the vulnerabilities of being LGBTI can be exploited. For example, being threatened to be outed to your community. In terms of mental health, we know that the rates of mental ill health are much higher due to that discrimination and so the continual traumas that LGBTI young people face across their life. As well as that, there is issues with accessing support, limited LGBTI specific supports, but also in mainstream services, often they don't understand the issues that we face and don't actually know how to support LGBTI young people properly to get the support that we need.
In a similar way to mainstream cohorts, there's a big link between family violence, homelessness and mental health. However, like Rory said, in particular, this community is particularly vulnerable and as well as experiencing high levels of intimate partner violence. There's also high levels of violence from family of origin, which is the leading cause of homelessness amongst young LGBTIQ+ people. There's also a limited amount of services that are provided for this group, and there are particular needs around safety planning and risk assessment that are often misunderstood, or there's not enough research to support these in mainstream services. We have LGBTIQ+ specific services.
I'd also say LGBTIQA+ young people are an extremely diverse cohort as well. So there are sort of differences in how people based on their sexuality or gender identity, but also thinking about sort of cultural background, socioeconomic status, all these things can make family violence, homelessness and mental health sort of look different, and you might need to be thinking about what are those specific communities and young people at those intersections, what do they actually need? Because that will look different, particularly for trans and gender diverse people. We know experience rates of intimate partner violence at a much higher rate than other cohorts, and same with sort of mental ill health as well. So just thinking about the fact that LGBTI young people are extremely diverse and have very diverse needs as well. So asking a young person about their pronouns is a really important thing because you need to know someone's pronouns in order to respect someone. I think the best way of asking is to keep it casual and also to introduce yourself with your own pronouns, so you're establishing that equity. It's really important to think about where you're asking, because asking someone about their pronouns is personal and can disclose their gender identity. So making sure it's more in a private space or you're not being overheard by other people. So for example, I would introduce myself with my pronouns. I'd be like, hi, I'm Rory. I use he, him or they, them pronouns. What pronouns would you like me to use for yourself? Or what pronouns do you use? It's also important to maybe check in, especially young people might be exploring their identity, their pronouns might change, They might be using multiple pronouns as well. So sometimes checking in as well is really great practice. Be like, hey, just wanted to just double check what pronouns you're using at the moment. That can be a really great conversation to have, and just to have it as a continual conversation and making sure you're asking every one of your clients, every one of your young people you're working with. You're not just picking the people that you assume are trans to ask that question. So it becomes ingrained in your practice and is normalised as well. Sometimes people get worried about getting a negative response. So sometimes people get worried about people saying, oh, why are you asking me that question? Or what are pronouns? And that is actually a fantastic opportunity to educate people. So to say, hey, pronouns are little words we use instead of people's names, like he, him, she, her, they, them. We ask everyone this question because we want to provide everyone at our service an inclusive and respectful service. We have trans and gender diverse people accessing our service, and we want to be inclusive of everyone. So that way it's a really good point to educate people, but also to sort of set the tone in terms of behaviour and inclusion within your service as well. So pronoun cueing can also be a really great tool to use as well, especially this is a way of sort of letting other people know about someone's pronouns and names. So for example, this can work if you're in handover or you're introducing a new client to staff members. The most important thing though, before you pronoun cue for someone, is to check in with that person. So just double check what pronouns and names they're using, and also if that's something they're comfortable to share with other people. If they are, pronoun cueing can be as simple as introducing someone, saying, hi, this is James, they use they, them pronouns, or just simply slipping someone's name and pronouns in a sentence, so saying, James and I went to the shop, they wore a really awesome jumper. So you can do that quite casually. You can also pronoun cue if someone is accidentally slipping up on someone's pronouns or might not know someone's pronouns. So for example, if someone said, James, he is really awesome, it could be a really great moment of allyship for that worker to say, actually James uses they, them pronouns, or to just slip they, them into the conversation saying, oh yes, James, they actually are really awesome. And that way it's a really gentle way of cluing in other people to someone's name and pronouns without it being confrontational. However, if someone isn't making the effort to step it up or use someone's pronouns, or if they're not getting it, that's when I would have a follow-up conversation and just to see what's going on, because misgendering and not using someone's pronouns is one of the biggest barriers, especially for trans and gender diverse people in accessing services. It's really important when people are accessing your service that you provide as many opportunities as possible for people to disclose their sexuality and gender identity. This is because, especially in homelessness and family violence and in mental health, someone's LGBTI identity could actually be a really big factor as to why they're accessing your service and could be a huge part of their experience. And we just can't make assumptions about whether or not someone is part of the LGBTIQ+ community. We look like everyone. You cannot possibly tell someone's gender identity or sexuality just by looking at them, or even from their name or their pronouns or how they behave. So we need to be creating as many opportunities for people to disclose their gender identity or sexuality as possible. We also need to make sure though that information is optional always for people's safety. When asking someone about their sexuality or gender identity, I think there are a few things you really need to consider. So number one is providing as many opportunities as possible for someone to disclose their gender identity, from intake forms to casual conversations to just making sure people feel like they're safe enough to actually express their experiences. As part of that safety, I think it's always important to make sure that people know the processes of confidentiality, so people understand if they tell you their sexuality or gender identity, who's going to know, who has access to that information, and what are their obligations for reporting or telling friends and family. So to make sure that people are informed about where that information will be shared. I think, again, having those options on intake forms, making sure that we're not making assumptions with language, to make sure that people have as many opportunities as possible to talk about their sexuality or gender identity. If it is relevant to your care, and if you're a caseworker, for instance, or working quite directly with a client, it might be a really great idea to just ask about how would you describe your gender identity, how would you describe your sexuality, because it might be incredibly relevant to the care you're providing. However, if it's less relevant to the care that you're providing and you might just need to know someone's name and pronouns to respect them, again, just same as asking someone's pronouns and names, keeping that casual, but also keeping in mind that confidentiality as well. think what's really important to keep in mind when we're working with the LGBTIQA+ community is we're talking about a community of people who've experienced a lot of discrimination and violence even when accessing support services. And even if you are a part of the LGBTI community, you might be the world's most super ally ever. How is anyone accessing your service going to know this? And there's actually it's a really important thing that you make yourself like as approachable, but also as sort of visually inclusive as you can. And there are some really simple things that you can do. Undertaking training, so making sure that you have an understanding about LGBTI identities, so you understand sort of more about the language and concepts a bit more. Wearing lanyards and pronoun badges, like those sort of visual cues so people can see that you're an ally or someone who might be more supportive. Introducing yourself with your pronouns or having a pronoun badge, having your pronouns in your lanyards instantly sort of suggests that you've done some training, that you have an understanding. So all those sorts of little things that you might not think of as big deals are actually huge deals. I know for myself, the first thing I do when entering any service or meeting someone is I'm scanning. I'm scanning for those rainbows, I'm scanning for those trans flags, I'm scanning for any indication to see how safe it is for me to talk about my experience. So any of those visual cues for yourself are really important. In making your service more inclusive, there are a lot of things you might need to consider, and there are so many areas of your service that you can work on to make more inclusive. So just like with a personal and to make yourself more approachable, the visual is really, really powerful. So thinking about what your environment looks like, how it might feel for an LGBTI person to enter that service. So simple posters and badges and lanyards, having flags, these things are really, really powerful, both in the physical space, on the website, to include LGBTI people as part of your policies, to make sure that if you've got anti-discrimination policies, that you name sexuality and gender identity as a part of that. I think it's really important that there's training across all staff, from management to on-the-ground staff to receptionists, because it needs to be a whole organisational culture to be inclusive. You might need to review policies and procedures and processes like the Rainbow Tick accreditation. It could be really, really helpful in doing that. However, there are simple things that your organisation can do as well, aside from trainings, just in terms of hiring LGBTI staff members, for instance. Making LGBTI identified positions instantly helps in terms of your cultural safety. I think another part of making your organisation more inclusive is also ensuring that your complaints and feedback mechanisms are known to all your clients. It's a really, I think sometimes services can get a bit nervous about complaints and feedback, but actually that's how we ensure that our services are the best they can be. Clients need to know that they can tell people if there are things that you're doing wrong, and that's the best way we can be an inclusive service. There is no sort of, here is now, this is where you're the most inclusive rainbow service ever, you're never going to have to do any work. We're all in a stages of learning and development, and inclusion is a continual process and a continual process of reflection. Consulting with other organisations and partnering with LGBTI organisations is another amazing way to make your service more inclusive. Partnering with organisations for specific campaigns, but also in terms of referrals as well. There is no one service that can meet all the needs of every single client. So with your referral pathways as well, thinking about, do you know of any LGBTI support services? What are the local support services in your area that are LGBTI inclusive? Creating your own referral pathways and networks is really, really amazing at what you can do. Celebrating LGBTI days, so like Ida Hobbit, Wear It Purple, Trans Day of Visibility. We have a lot of days, take your pick. But promoting that even on social media, even if you don't do it as part of your whole organisation, because LGBTI people need to know that they're going to be safe in your service, and there is no such thing as being over rainbowed or being overly, I guess, enthusiastic about showing your support to our community. Ally, I think, as a word, is not so much an identifier as much as it should be an action. I think to be an ally isn't something that you can put on yourself. I think it's a part of the work that you do to support LGBTI people. And I think part of that is advocacy work. So a lot of the things we talked about in terms of making your service and self more inclusive is almost a way of sort of overcoming some of the barriers that LGBTI people face as a community, from like social, political, legal, all the sorts of issues we face in society. An ally is someone who helps sort of advocate for us and helps sort of overcome some of those barriers. And I think part of that is to know your place and to listen to the LGBTI people, listen to LGBTI advocates and what we're asking, but also to, in terms of your client, checking in with them in terms of asking them how you could be a better support, how you could be a better ally. Because it might be about, for example, if your client is getting misgendered or might experience discrimination, that might be your role as an ally to actually go and challenge that and to take that complaint, to write a complaint on behalf of your client and to help them with that process. At the same time, you also want to make sure that that is something that your client wants. So to always check in to make sure you're not overstepping as an ally. But I think allies have a really important role in doing the work and emotional labour that LGBTI people either can't do or shouldn't always have to do. And allies are a huge part of how we've made such big strides in terms of our community and our rights. And we need allies now more than ever, and to continually advocate for us as well.
Organisationally, we find a lot of the time that it is the queer workers in a service that are often doing the championing and the work to improve the accessibility and inclusive practice within that service. So being a good ally within your service is, taking the initiative to work towards rainbow tick accreditation, or to organise the training or do the research for yourself, so that the onus isn't on the queer workers within that service to do that and to be doing that heavy lifting, which often is the case.
A really important role that an ally can play is also in challenging discrimination as well. As Ash said, a lot of the time the onus is on the LGBTI person to sort of forward initiatives, to be sort of the drivers of that cultural change, but also challenge the discrimination that they actually might be facing directly as well, and same with our clients. And sometimes we as a community, sometimes we don't even recognise when we're being discriminated against, because we often have quite a low bar for how we're supposed to be treated as people who experience discrimination all the time. Sometimes we don't even understand that how we're being treated is wrong, or that we could be treated in another way. Along with that, it can also be really tiring and exhausting to challenge it every single time. And so a good ally's role would be in supporting someone to challenge that discrimination, to challenge it for us, and also to be with us for making those complaints, and to sort of be the person that sort of drives that cultural change as well. So it's not always on us to have to call it out and to have to make those changes and advocate for ourselves all the time.
And educate as well.
Yeah. I think if you struggle to support someone just because of their sexuality and or gender identity, I would suggest you're working in the wrong sector. And I think both in federally and state levels, we actually have a legal obligation to treat LGBTI people with respect and also with inclusive practice. Yes, there are some religious-based exemptions, but they don't necessarily always apply. And I think it's really important that at the very least, we actually have an ethical obligation to support every single client that enters our service. And I do have a question of, if not you, who? And in the case of which you might be working in a large organisation, you might have LGBTI specific workers, there might be other people who might be more informed or have a better understanding, or might have a bit more of a cultural, cohesion better with LGBTI clients. And so if that's the case, then yeah, maybe passing on a client might be the best sort of practice to do. However, not every service and not every place is going to actually have the resources or the people necessarily to do that. And I think even in regional settings or in smaller organisations, you might be one of the few or only workers for that person. I think on one end, in a lot of cases, someone's sexuality, gender identity, or just their LGBTI identity might not be a factor in how you work with them. And I would suggest that the exact same sort of ways of treating people with respect, keeping things client-centred and led, and the work that you're trained to do, it shouldn't be influenced by whether someone is LGBTI or not. If someone does need specific support with their sexuality or gender identity, and either it's a values or a knowledge disconnect and you're not quite sure of how to support, again, we do have places to get secondary consultation, but passing someone on, making sure there's a warm referral and a warm handover is really important. The last thing that you want to do is to shut the doors on an LGBTI person or any vulnerable person accessing a service. If someone is accessing your service because they're experiencing homelessness, family violence, or mentally ill health, they deserve support. And by telling someone that they're not able to access your service or you're unable to support them, that is telling someone that they're not worthy of support, and they might not have any other place that they can access and go. And so rather than create that barrier, I always recommend warm referral pathways, ensuring that you do support that person even if it is just to connect them with another service. I think another thing to consider with the law as well is it's sometimes really hard to have an ethics or values-based argument with co-workers or other services that might not be inclusive of LGBTI people. So even when you're working with people who might not have those values, going back to the law is actually a really powerful tool. So saying, hey, it doesn't actually matter about your opinion, doesn't matter about your values or beliefs, and I'm not here to challenge them. But in this work setting, when we're working to support people, we actually have a legal and ethical obligation to treat everyone who needs our service with an inclusive and respectful service. There shouldn't be ever a time where you should feel like your beliefs are compromised by working with an LGBTI person. However, we need to make sure that every single person is receiving that support and care. And the support and care you give to an LGBTI person shouldn't look any different to the support and care you give to any other person. So I think it's really, really important to always remember that LGBTIQA+ people are a part of many different communities as well as the LGBTI community. So we sit on many different intersections of culture, race, socioeconomic status, disability. And so these are things you might need to keep in mind when working with all LGBTIQA+ people. But particularly working with certain communities, you might need to keep in mind about the resources that you're showing in the referral pathways and to actually make sure that they're appropriate and what your client wants. So for some people, their sexuality and gender identity might be at the forefront of what they need and want from your service. However, for some people, their cultural identity might actually be more important or equally as important as well. And so you need to consider their sort of safety and connection to all their different parts of community. For example, queer, trans and intersex people of colour might experience racism both within the mainstream community but also within LGBTIQA+ communities as well. So finding spaces where people can feel safe both in their cultural identity and in their LGBTI identity is really important. And so connecting with QTPOC specific groups might be a really important part of that, or connecting with QTPOC specific mentors or peer workers, or making sure that the resources you're giving people aren't just full of white people, can be really important ways that you support someone in their intersectionality. But also, just like with all sort of client-centered care, asking that person what's important to them in their life. They might feel perfectly connected to their LGBTI community but actually want more help with connecting to their faith, and vice versa. You can't make assumptions about how people's LGBTI identity interacts with any other parts of their identity. So again, just keeping it client-centered, making sure it's driven by what they are wanting and needing, but keeping in mind that all aspects of someone's identity could be really important.